Education. Michael Williams, founder and president of Altius Financial, founder of the Defender of Capitalism project, and Łukasz Pawłowski, managing editor and columnist of Kultura Liberalna, who I hope you all know, and Bobby Herzberg, distinguished senior fellow and in Hayek program for advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics. Welcome, and thank you for coming to Warsaw. I would like to start with your feelings and remarks. I know that John was inspired by Professor Balcerowicz's speech, so we will go with you first. Please, John.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. I've been to Warsaw before. I've also spoken at conferences in Gdansk and Krakow, and I love your country, and I am so proud of the progress you've made. My first visit to Poland was the summer of 1989. And that, of course, was the year of the Solidarity election. And, of course, a few months later, the Berlin Wall fell. I was working in Europe at the time for the Wall Street Journal Europe. And I must tell you, I'm probably the only person from the West who was clearly ambivalent about the fall of the Berlin Wall. Of course, I celebrated the freedom. But I was having so much fun watching the collapse of communism. I had been arrested in 4 communist countries that year, in 1989. And when the Berlin Wall fell, I suddenly realized I was not going to be able to collect them all. So my collection was over. But seriously, Poland led the way in the collapse of communism, and the world will never, never forget that. But now, of course, there are new challenges. And we heard some of that from Professor Balcerowicz, and I would like to respond in part to what he said. I understand. I agree with the vast majority of what he said. But I think the hardest thing to do when faced with political challenges and the threats that you have to the rule of law in Poland is to recognize that there are political realities that must be addressed at the same time you address philosophical realities. Let me explain. We have a mystery to solve, and it is a mystery that is sweeping the Western democracies. Whether it's Poland, or the Czech Republic, or Hungary, or Slovakia, or Austria, or Germany, or France, or the Netherlands, or Brexit in Britain, or the rise of Donald Trump in the United States. I could go on and on with, in Italy, the Five-Star Movement, which comes from the anarchic left, or Greece, the Syriza movement, which comes from the extreme left. I could go on and on with countries where we have seen the rise of populism. In order to understand and to combat populism, I submit to you we must oppose it, especially when it is in government and it actually can do damage, at the same time that we try to understand better the reasons why people vote for populists. It is not a betrayal of classical liberal beliefs to understand the motivations of people who are disagreeing with you or voting in a different direction. Let me explain. Globalization, migration of populations, integration of economies, has spread dramatically since 1989. Vast majority of those changes have been good. But there is a fundamental reality. In all of the countries I have mentioned, there are 2 groups of people that have changed the political conversation. The conversation used to be left versus right. I submit to you it has changed to ins versus outs. Who are the ins? What David Goodhart, the British writer, says are the anywheres. The anywheres are between 20 and 25% of the population of an industrial democracy. They are the people who have benefited most from globalization, integration of the world economy. They are more highly educated. They are more mobile. Many of them view themselves as having transcended the nation state. Their loyalty is to the European Union more than it is to their nation state. It is to the United Nations more than it is to their nation state. It is to universal values more than it is to their nation state. They are citizens of the world. Well, great for them. They have done well. They have taken their talents and their ability, and sometimes, sadly, their positions as crony capitalists in some situations where the rule of law has been introduced, and done very well. They are the beneficiaries of this vast economic change, and they are trying to entrench those gains, as there is their right in a democracy. But they're only about 20% of the population. Over 50% of the population in all of these countries are the outs, the somewheres. What does it mean to be somewhere? It means you are rooted in the place you grew up in, where your ancestors were, where your family was, where your faith is centered. You tend not to move away from that place, or you tend not to move very far. You put far more faith in family, in religion, in tradition, than the anywheres do. You're probably less educated, you're probably less sophisticated, but you also have an innate common sense. You know what is BS and you know what works, because you live it in your daily life as you try to earn a living and raise a family. The somewheres feel as if the anywheres have distanced themselves from the nation that they love because they're more patriotic in the traditional sense than the anywheres, and they feel they have been betrayed by policies which benefit the anywheres and have ignored the somewheres. I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but I'm saying the perception certainly exists. If you don't believe me, look at the election results. So how do we address this? I think we have to address this in several ways. We have to have much clearer and sharper communication. And as Professor Balcerowicz pointed out, we must point out the bankruptcy of the populist positions. They never discuss specifics. They always discuss generalities. They appeal to emotional instincts rather than to reason and rationality. We must have much clearer and sharper critiques of their proposals. We must have much clearer and sharper presentations of our proposals, with the emphasis on how it will affect the daily lives of people who wake up in the morning, go to work, come home at night, and have very few savings and are just trying to keep their family together and hoping that there might be some opportunity and prosperity for their children. We need to communicate more with the somewheres. Now, this does not come naturally. I'm an anywhere. I admit it. But I have relatives and friends in the great American states of Michigan and Wisconsin who voted for Donald Trump proudly. After all, the choice between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump was not a choice between good versus bad. It was a choice between the evil of two lessers, to reverse an English expression. So if we don't communicate with these people, if we don't try to understand their concerns, we will never be able to shift those election results sufficiently to give our policies a chance. I'll leave you with this. Understand the gulf between you and the somewheres. How many of you have been to a party in the last few months where wine was served? Okay, in America we call this a cocktail party. Many anywheres in America go to cocktail parties. But many more Americans go to places where beer is the major drink. That's where the somewheres are. We need to go out and have a beer with some of the somewheres, and we need to have a conversation with them. We condemn the people who are in government pursuing the policies and intimidating us and appealing to the somewheres. But we don't condemn their voters. We try to understand them and have a conversation with them.
Thank you, John. So, after the panel, John is inviting to a beer with somewheres.
Only after 4 o'clock.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very interesting, although we have run a bit further from European values, but I understand it is still in the topic, but more as the response to what Professor said about populism. Mikołaj Pisarski.
So, getting back to the topic of our contemporary well-being, I believe that we should take a step back and first examine the causes of this whole great period of the great enrichment that is happening right now during our lifetime and began approximately 200 years ago. First in the region of the Northern Sea, later engulfed whole Europe, and finally spill over, engulfing almost all of the contemporary world. And to examine the roots and the causes of this great enrichment period, we should first look at it and realize the great scale of this enrichment being discussed. Because if we were to look at the whole history of the humankind, we would notice something very striking. Starting in the Stone Age, later through the Antique, ancient Egypt, Roman, Greek Empire, finally Middle Ages, we would notice that the line representing the human progress would be almost flat. And suddenly, approximately 200 years ago, bam, the rocket of the human progress is taking off. Something happened, and I do mean a rocket, not a plane, because the takeoff was almost vertical. Something happened that transformed our life in a scale never seen, never before experienced in our whole history of the humankind. So if we are to look closely at this, and for us at the Mises Institute of Economic Education it is really exciting because just recently we've published probably the most wonderful book discussing the causes of this period called Industrial Revolution and the following changes around our world. I'm talking obviously about Bourgeois Dignity, authored by Deirdre McCloskey. We were to find some puzzling thoughts because the main argument presented by Deirdre McCloskey, who was here, as Chris already mentioned 2 years ago, is that the materialistic explanation, the explanation that most of us feel comfortable with, is just not enough. And I will not be trying to deprive you of the pleasure and fun of reading the book, which I strongly recommend, and instead I will share a brief story that, in my opinion, pretty well encapsulates the core argument that McCloskey presents in her book. And this is a story of a great Chinese admiral Zheng He. Is any of you familiar with the gentleman? Great. Because if we are to take this step back and go back to 15th century China, there would be absolutely no indications that the Northern Sea or the Europe is the place that the Industrial Revolution and this great leap will happen. Instead, our eyes would be focused around China. And Zheng He is such a representative character because he was the admiral of possibly the largest, in terms of size, number of vessels, fleet in the history of mankind. He boarded 7 voyages spanning all across the Indian Ocean, all the way to Africa in the 15th century, and brought back enormous riches. But what's really striking is what happened when the centralized power in the Chinese government decided to intervene. The leadership changed, and the whole fleet that was connecting China with the world, establishing trade routes, allowing them to experience and engage in the exchange of thoughts and exchange of inventions in the whole region of the Indian Ocean and even far to the Africa, was sentenced to burn and was left to rot in the docks. So what I take out from this brief story is that we basically have two competing mindsets that can or will contribute or prevent us from leading a well or prosperous life. And one of them is the mindset of a shipbuilder, entrepreneur, a person who is not only willing to risk and build the fleet, but also is willing to celebrate and encourage those who are daring enough to take the risk and celebrate the achievements and fruits brought back from their endeavors. And the other mindset is the mindset of a ship burner, the mindset of a centralized Chinese government or other political power who is willing to sentence and condemn the well-being of their own people in terms of a short gain or their own agenda, and sentence it to being burned or left to rot in the dock of old Chinese empire in the 15th century. So the problem that we should always be wary of is that these two mindsets are usually competing in every place or at every time, no matter the political framework. So right now, it happens so that approximately 200 years ago, the mindset of a shipbuilder, entrepreneur, was prevailing in Europe. And we've achieved this point where most of us were not only willing to take risks, but also most of us were daring to encourage and celebrate the results and fruits of the entrepreneur's labor. What is happening right now, or might be happening, is a step back from this positive mindset. So we should always be wary not to allow ourselves to condemn or damage the possibilities provided by this willing to take risk for realizing of their political agenda. Thank you.
The perspective of the businessman, which may be a bit different than from us ideologists. Michael Williams, please.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the discourse that I've heard both on this panel and before the prior speakers. I'm trying to figure out what to contribute here. I am a business person. I also kind of consider myself a philosopher. Freedom is on the wane. Populism, nationalism is on the rise, and it's a bad thing. And I think that the issue of values is crucial. That vertical rocket that was spoken about just now is an absolute miracle in terms of what has happened to raise the standard of living of the ins and the outs. And I think it's worth studying that. The cause and effect of that industrial revolution was not just material. When we talk about values, I kind of get confused. I mean, values, in my view, are things that I want. I mean, we talk about them sometimes in the collective sense. How many of you really value democracy or even the rule of law or these kinds of institutions? Well, as libertarians, we value these ideas, but I value my family. I value my work. I value my education. I value my life. So the values that I talk about are the values of the individual, or valuing the individual, which is what I think we were talking about. The entrepreneur is the person who supplies the values for that idea of, freedom for. The government and the ruling institutions should be set up to be freedom from, meaning freedom from the forces of others violating my rights. But then, as was spoken in the prior panel, well, that leaves that void. What are the values for? And so when I think about the rise of populism and the rise of nationalism, I used to blame politicians. And I don't anymore. I started working with them. And they're really just vessels. They're vessels for popular ideas. They're vessels for the culture that we have created. I blame you. Not you necessarily, any individuals, but you the students and you the academics, because you're the ones who work with these ideas. And ideas are what's crucial. I think I was invited on this roadshow a little bit to talk about an organization that I work for. And I'm really happy that we're at a private educational institution, because I believe that education is where the most innovation needs to come from. Education should be completely privatized. Now, I'm a laissez-faire capitalist, and I make declarations like that. All economic activity, all values are created in the private sector. So the government has no role other than protecting rights. So it's wonderful to see entrepreneurialism and innovation in education, and that's what's crucial. I work for a true entrepreneur in the educational sphere because we're training leaders. Our tagline is called Timeless Principles, Leaders in Action. The organization is called the Leadership Program in the Rockies. My sister actually happens to be the entrepreneur of this organization, and I happen to create a program along with that we call the Defenders of Capitalism Project. And the Defenders of Capitalism project was born out of this idea that politicians just don't necessarily get it. They're vessels for ideas. This language of freedom that we speak about should be universal by now. The economics is settled. Any economist will tell you, if you value human life, if you value anything about human life, health, wealth, prosperity, happiness, even spiritual values, you set the people free. You have plenty of experiments. The laboratory of history has been shown. East versus West Germany, North and South Korea, Venezuela, these examples were given before. In any industry where you have more freedom, you have more innovation, and more prosperity being created. The economics is settled. If you want, and if you care about people in large numbers, politicians often speak about the social good and these vague concepts about social good and social justice and the public good, which is really meaningless in my mind. But if you do care about people, if you care about people and their prosperity and their well-being, you advocate for the values of individualism. So our solution at the leadership program of the Rockies and the Defenders of Capitalism is to train leaders, not just policy leaders, not just people who are running for office. We've had significant office holders and people who want to be in office, and that's great. But we also train citizens, because it's not just the people who are running for office or who want to claim that leadership title. It's everyday citizens who need to understand these ideas and hold those people, those leaders, accountable, whether it's in office, legislatures, or in their local communities. So the first principle we teach them is about individual rights and the sanctity, the sovereignty of the individual and their property. And that goes along with what's been discussed already. Property rights, the rule of law. That's the essential role for government. That's the second principle. What is the proper role of government? Is that ever very well defined in your courses here? You ask that question, do your leaders say, this, I have identified for you, this is the proper role of government, and this is the standard against which we measure all other activities of government and every role, every law or regulation that comes into effect. We train them in these ideas of the proper role of government. And again, the proper role, according to a classical liberal enlightenment thinking, is now and should be very narrow, very strong, but very narrow in protecting rights, protecting the rights of the individual, protecting property. And no other role, not educating or helping retire or building airplanes other than for defense. No other role, not delivering your mail. All of that is wrong. All that is not the government's role. So most of what the governments do in the world today is not their proper role. Now, there is no such thing as a capitalist economy today. There's no such free market. And the world or any particular nation is always waning one way or the other. My ideal, and our ideal as freedom lovers, should be having a capitalist, pro-individualist, pro-free economy. But the only way that we can do that is if we become, and this is our third principle, engaged citizens. And understanding the first two, understanding that it's the individual who actually is the valuer. The individual is valuing their life, and so they value democratic principles, maybe not so much democratic, but Republican principles, representative principles, but certainly the rule of law principles to protect their values and hold their leaders accountable. And those are the things that I think we should fight for. So I agree with John. It is about the ins and the outs, but it's more about the individual versus the collective. And the collective, when you hear this notion of the collectivism, that should be your red flag. When you hear people talking about the social good, the public good, that should be a red flag, because they're talking about basically excusing all the violations of rights that have gone on throughout history in the name of the public good, which actually has the opposite impact. And with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, and it's so nice to hear a real businessman not expecting the great support from the government to run its business. It's very rare in Poland now, so it's just, nice for my ears. Łukasz Pawłowski.
Well, I thought of starting in somehow different way, but I think I have to address what's been said already, because when John Fans spoke about those somewheres and anywheres, you have to underline, you have to stress the fact that those people, those somewheres, they want protection. You cannot just leave that aside and say that all they want is individual freedom. That's what they are protesting about. They have too many. No, that's my interpretation of what.
Say that.
They don't. You think that what they need is being set free from.
Please finish, but don't misrepresent what I said.
No. What I'm saying is you differentiated arguing after Dave Goodhart's book that there are somewheres and anywheres, and what those people who are called somewheres want quite often is stronger protection from the national governments. That's why they turn to nationalism. That's why, for example, Theresa May, appealing to those somewheres, said that if you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. She tried to appeal to those people. She tried to tell them that we are there to protect you. And obviously that was also the rhetoric used by people who supported Brexit. We need to take back control from the European level, and we have to protect our people in a more effective way. So there is this sentiment, and you cannot ignore it by saying that what the people actually want is more freedom in the sense that they want to be left alone. I think it is quite the opposite. Many of those people who John said were somewheres, I'm not saying that's your interpretation, that's my interpretation. What they want is some kind of protection from their governments. They feel betrayed or they feel abandoned by the free market capitalism. They feel that their governments are quite often powerless because decisions are made somewhere else, and they want to take back control. This is one of the major slogans of the Brexit campaign, take back control. So you cannot, if you want to reach out to those people, you cannot ignore this sentiment. And I think this also applies to what is happening in Poland. So to say that what actually will set us free from this wave of populism or nationalism is to argue for less governments and to argue for more free market may have actually the opposite effect. Look what has happened also to the Republican Party in the US. They have a candidate who is probably at least as left-wing as its counter-candidate in many respects, that he promises protectionism rather than freedom and free market. A free market. So you have to take that into account. Actually, liberalism is one of the major notions that is being criticized right now by many of those populists and many of those nationalists. And quite often they openly say, we are Democrats, we value democracy. This is the value, the core value that we want to pursue. But what is corrupting this democracy of ours is actually liberalism. Viktor Orban does not beat about the bush. He says quite clearly that he wants to build an illiberal democracy in Hungary. He actually said in one of his famous speeches that what is happening today in Hungary can be interpreted as an attempt of the respective political leadership to harmonize relationship between the interests and achievements of individuals with interests and achievements of the community and the nation, meaning that Hungarian nation is not a simple sum of individuals, but a community that needs to be organized, strengthened, and developed. And in this sense, the new state that we are building is an illiberal state, a non-liberal democracy. So look what he's doing here. He's saying that there are interests and goals and individual rights, and it is quite often difficult to harmonize them with the interests of the state. And in the case of conflict between one and the other, obviously the state should prevail. And obviously, who defines the interests of the state is the ruling party or the ruling majority, or in the case of Hungary, it's Viktor Orban himself. So there is, I agree, there is the danger that some of those politicians want to suppress individual rights in the name of building a greater good, of pursuing national interests. We know this rhetoric from Poland as well. But how to combat that? I don't think that just arguing for more individual freedom without any limits or without any context would do a great job. I think the major conflict we are seeing right now is the attack on liberalism in the entity we know as liberal democracy. Everyone wants to be a Democrat. Even Vladimir Putin holds elections and he would call himself a Democrat, but he wouldn't call himself a liberal. So if we want to defend the system that we value and we cherish here in Europe and the values that we cherish, I think it's the liberal part that we have to defend. And now the question comes, how do you define that? Do you only define that in economic terms, in terms of economic freedom, or in terms of political freedom? And here comes, and I think what we even on this panel would disagree about is this definition of liberalism. Because, you know, back in the communist times, you may know this joke, there was a question, what is the difference between democracy and people's democracy? And the answer was roughly the same as between a chair and an electric chair. And I think the same goes the same goes for democracy, for illiberal democracy and liberal democracy. Democracy cannot function without its liberal component. And this liberal component is obviously the protection of individual rights. It's obviously the rule of law that should be respected, and it's all worth fighting for. However, just one more thing. You should look at liberalism or liberal democracy as democracy with legal airbags. This liberal part of democracy protects people who are currently a minority, who are currently somewhere in opposition to the government. Liberal part protects them from the so-called tyranny of majority. And that's why you need it for. So democracy is just a system of electing people, of electing your politicians, your ruling class. But it's liberalism that actually protects those people who are currently out of power not to be abused, because tyrant does not necessarily need to be a man or a woman, a single man or woman. It can be the majority or the ruling party and so on and so forth. So if somebody tells you that it's all fine, we're just building an illiberal democracy here, nothing to see here, we're just building a slightly different version of democracy, it's obviously a lie, because democracy without this liberal component, without the respect for individual rights and minority rights, cannot function. However, and this is the last point I'd like to make, it's not only the rule of law that needs to be protected, and I think that's one of the mistakes liberals, for example, in Poland quite often make, when they say that we just need to defend the courts, because thus we are defending the rule of law. We need to defend constitution because it's being violated. That's not enough, because quite often our government does not violate any laws, right? But still what they're doing should be protested against. So what you also have to underline, what you also have to stress are unwritten norms. And here I refer to the recent book published by those Harvard political scientists, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. The book is called How Democracies Die. And they point out also to this fact that unwritten norms that govern our collective life, let's say, or political life, should be protected. And they refer to this famous case when Barack Obama nominated Merrick Garland, a centrist liberal, to replace Antonin Scalia at the Supreme Court. Normally, the Senate should give should give Garland a hearing and then decide whether they want to approve of him or not, whether they want to nominate him or not. They didn't even give him a hearing. And that obviously did not violate any written rule. They didn't break the law. They just broke the norms. And this is how quite often Levitsky and Ziblatt say democracies die. They used to die on the streets during a military coup, during a revolution, like in Cuba, for example. That wasn't a democracy, but there was a revolution, or military coups in Latin America. Today, quite often, they die step by step by violating not only constitutional written norms, so that is to say, not only by violating the rule of law, but also by violating the unwritten norms that we should abide by. So I would like to underline this point as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm listening to all you, and it's very remarkable that all of you actually mentioned one thing which was which was common to all your speeches. It was protecting rights of an individual. This is the only sentence you actually all of you said. I'm wondering whether our last panelist, Bobby Hertzberg, would refer to the same.
Well, it'll come out in one way or another, I'm sure. It is a pretty common theme. We all like the freedom. We all like, I think, we share a value of individual rights and individual freedoms, and we would like smaller government. We would like more vibrant economy and civic society. The challenge is, and I think it was posed by John Fund to kick us off here, at the end of the day, we're also risk averse. The reality is we worry about some of the downside of failures in the market. Freedom comes with a great deal of responsibility. And one of the challenges is how do individuals deal with the difficulties that they will encounter if, in fact, we're going to have the dog-eat-dog competition that we want in a competitive economic society. And so today we're moving into a new economic pattern, a new, perhaps, technological revolution, just like the hockey stick took us the last time around in the Industrial Revolution and changing the nature of markets. The new one is about technology. And with any of these major transitions, we're going to have a lot of people who will be left behind by those transitions. And what they're asking is, what happens to me? And that's where I think the demand for bigger states and more growth is occurring. It is that what happens to me when through no fault of my own, the world is passing me by. Computers and robotics are taking my job. The jobs are going overseas to different labor markets, etc. And people really do demand that. And so what I think we need to do as we talk about individual freedom, and this is in every society, these advanced democracies, we need to recognize that with that comes this individual responsibility to care for yourself or care for those around you in some way. That's where I think the problems have gone awry. Freedom has been lost because we have asked the state to take on this role of responsibility. They have become responsible for social welfare programs. And those social welfare programs, in part because they have been successful in dealing with health issues, in dealing with the sustainability of a good living standard, etc., we now are actually living longer. We're living, we're drawing more from the state. There are more people that will be retired and drawing on pensions than there will be working. This is only going to be exacerbated as we move into the era of robotics and other things taking over many of the especially unskilled jobs that are out there, or lower skilled jobs that are out there. As these things happen, we can see more people making demands for helping them through these transition periods. And I think that that has led to what we see across Europe and in the United States and actually in Japan and other areas as well, this unsustainable entitlement crisis that we see. We cannot pay for it. The demographics do not work. The numbers do not add up. We all know it. Everybody nods about it all along, and yet we're not really dealing with it. Well, how would a group that wants more liberal or a smaller state deal with it? Well, I think we need to look back to the way we've dealt with this throughout history. There have always been challenges that come from employment and droughts and other things that happen that were beyond your control. How did we deal with them in the past? We dealt with them with family. We dealt with them with churches. We dealt with them with charitable organizations and with mutual aid societies or friendly societies. We used to address these things by doing them within our communities and taking care of each other. Now, how is that different than the way we're doing it through the state now? Well, the biggest difference is if you're in a mutual aid society, you pay in and you take out when you need. But you pay in, and if you only take out and you are not paying in, you don't get to stay in that mutual aid society. Nobody gets to continually be dependent on the mutual aid society. It is reciprocal. But when it is the state and it is distant, it is much easier for us to say them against us, and I can draw because they're very wealthy and I'm poor, or I am not having these opportunities, or I'm seeing others, the them that John was talking about. And as we move down that road, I think we have moved away from that responsibility side that comes with this type of protection. And so if we're going to move forward in this, we really have to address it. We have to figure out how to revitalize the very real societies, the organizations that have allowed us to deal with real people's concerns and risks without turning just to the state to do it. We don't need another government program to do this, but we do need something that will address this. And if it's not going to be government, then civic society of some sort has to step up and take it. And I think that is the biggest problem facing values in Europe and in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you have great panelists here, and you can ask them whatever you like, right? Anybody has a question? Yeah, sir, in the red shirt, please.
Thank you. I have a question to Mr. Williams. Well, basically, all of you said that the government role is too big now, and the influence of the government is very huge. And you said that what government's role now is not their role, and they're not doing now what they are intending for. And my question is, what they should do, and what's their role? What's the role of government? Thank you.
So, if you understand that the natural rights view of the world, that people need freedom to thrive, and that was a number of things that I talked about and that have been talked about on both panels, implicit. People need freedom to survive and thrive, to do well, and as I was saying, the experiment has been done. People do better under freedom throughout history, and they do worse under force. So, properly defined, the role is the government protects rights. So it is that institution of justice. It's the institution that says we are protecting the freedom from your fellow citizens, from threats to you, for you to act. Jefferson defined the purpose of government is that institution that's there to recognize and protect individuals for their right to pursue their life, their happiness, their freedom, their pursuit of happiness, not their happiness. You know, no one can really give you happiness, and you can't do it through providing material comfort. It's recognizing what an individual is and their need to act. You know, to the freedom to act, and that's why you have entrepreneurialism and when you have freedom, you have those entrepreneurs who do provide the vision. They do provide a positive vision for how to act. One other point I wanted to make real quick. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think a crucial distinction that people need to understand is the difference between economic power and political power. We make this equivocation about power, but economic power, properly understood, is earned power. It's a creation of values versus the use of force and making you do something through that force. Thank you.
I have a question to Ms. Roberta. You said about that we don't need ideas from government because we have all brains. What's your solution and idea to stop this process of from the history, from the church, all these things that happened, and what do you think? Maybe more public solutions and maybe opportunities for people. What do you think?
We have actually, as humans, we are very capable of handling things. We forget that. I lived most of my life. I lived in the Western United States, and in the Western United States, we did not wait for government to do things. The reason being that we were pretty rural, and if you waited for government, you waited a long time. Mostly neighbors helped. People just did stuff. You did things. I'm now living in the east, the northeast of the United States, right outside Washington, D.C. Nobody does anything for themselves outside of Washington, D.C. They call someone. Now, that's good, too. It's an economy. People call and hire people, and the government comes or private people come. But there is something about helping your neighbor and helping each other that leads you to be confident that you can handle these things. And that is lost sometimes as we start to depend on each other. Now, why I say we need to get there is the numbers do not work for continuing the current social entitlement world that we have. Poland is not that bad off yet in terms of this, but the bulk of what they spend their money on is pensions. And we are aging. And we are aging and living much, much longer relative to the number of people working. And those calculus just do not add up. And so we are going to have to say, how do we do it for ourselves? By saying, maybe we only help those who absolutely need it. In the U.S., one of the things we saw in terms of mutual aid is they were eliminated by government regulations that said you could not lend money unless you had this much money in the bank. And mutual aid societies lent the money that came in the door one week to people the next week. It was kind of just a rotating arrangement. I'll help my neighbor, and next time I'm in trouble, they're going to come over and help me build my barn, whatever. If, in fact, the regulation says now you have to have a year's worth of capital before you can start to give it to anybody else, that destroys them. So one way is to get government out of the way and let some of these come back. That would be my answer. Anybody else?
You have a history in this country of thinking differently. Solidarność was an independent union, but it was also a mutual aid society. It helped its members when they needed help, sometimes to get out of jail. The government and the policies that Professor Balcerowicz was involved in the 1990s helped create a nonprofit sector, an independent sector in Poland, The Civil Development Forum is an example of that. You need much more of that as counter examples to the power of the state to offer favors and privileges and dangle temptation in front of people. I'll take 90 seconds to go through a thought experiment. I apologize for the time. Let's imagine every one of you tomorrow is 1 million zlotys richer than you are right now. Tomorrow morning. Maybe you won the lottery. Maybe you had an inheritance. Maybe your business did very well. Whatever. You have 1 million zlotys more than you have today. The only requirement is you must donate 10% of that money, 100,000 zlotys, to help the poor. Now, you have a choice. How many of you would take that 100,000 zlotys and in order to help the poor would give it to the government welfare agency here in Warsaw? How many? Raise your hand. Okay. Well, that's called a minority. I've asked that question now before 21,000 people in 15 countries. I'm up to 7 yeses. 7. That should tell us something very important about what common sense is in people. Even the somewheres who want to be protected understand there are limits to that protection, and they also understand the distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. We all know there are local organizations, churches, family organizations in our neighborhood who would do a better job helping people with their real everyday problems than the state. We need to develop a much bigger nonprofit sector, perhaps by allowing charitable contributions to be deducted from tax in Poland, which has created the rise of the American nonprofit sector. We need a much better counterexample in the nonprofit independent sector that Roberta talked about to compare and contrast with the inefficiency and the dependency of the state, which is driving us to bankruptcy.
Gentleman here in the blue shirt. Oh, sorry, you were first, right?
Good morning.
And then here, gentleman in the 4th row, as I see.
Good morning. I have a question to Mr. Williams regarding the schools or the education system. You defend that the education systems should be private, 100% private. So I'll ask if you agree that when we defend the free market, we cannot be pro 100% control or the monopoly, right? So if we are skipping or getting out the government as providing the education, and we have to consider that the state is a company as well, we are going against free market, right? Can you agree with me?
Did you say the state is a company as well?
I think so.
I don't agree with that.
Probably the state is the biggest company in every country because it's the company with more number of associated.
See, I think that's part of the problem, though, and I don't mean to interrupt your question, but that is part of the problem. Is people see economic power and political power as similar, and I think that's the birth of cronyism. People say, well, if we can just do things more efficiently, or if I can just get a little profit here on the side, that's entirely the wrong idea. The government is a specific kind of entity, and it's derived from the nature of human...
right?
Sorry, go ahead.
It exists, right? The state.
It does.
And it exists as a company. So we have to acknowledge it and to assume it.
We have cronies, you're right.
No, I'm
saying here's what we should have, and we should fight that idea of cronyism.
Okay, but we can keep on this discussion, and it will always be as a company. And actually, if we defend free market, I think as institution, if you prefer to call it like that, they are free to act on the market. In this case, education as well as all other companies. So I would ask also if there's no relation on those 200 years ago rocket science. If it didn't happen, probably very close and after the monopoly of education get out from the church.
Excuse me, with all due respect, the state is the only entity I know that has the monopoly of force. It can send police to your door and arrest you. sometimes justified and sometimes not.
I totally agree with it.
Except for Venezuela and a few crony companies in Venezuela, or Cuba, which are state-owned, I don't know of any company that can do that. So to equate a corporation, which is an association of private individuals binding together to escape liability, with an entity that is the monopoly of force, is like comparing an apple to an orange. They may both be fruit, but they're not the same.
But if we exclude them from the market, are we not going against free market, is my question.
I think we've exhausted this.
No, thank you. Let's give the voice to other people. Here we had in the fourth row, please. Yeah, yeah. And if we get back a bit to the topic today, not only to basics of liberalism, which we can discuss later, of course.
I have the question to Mr. Pawłowski. You said that the government not only breaks constitutional laws, but it also follows some laws which are anti-freedom, and that was wrong. But you identified both of these as some sort of problems, so would you be okay with the government deliberately breaking some constitutional anti-freedom law in order to provide more freedom, and why?
No, obviously not, because that would be breaking the rule of law. My point was that if you only focus when challenging a populist, nationalist, anti-liberal government or regime, you cannot only focus on what they are doing or wrong legally. So, for example, you cannot only focus on defending the freedom of the courts or the freedom of the media, for example, and saying that is the violation, let's say, of the Constitution. Because you can easily imagine that in 2 years' time in Poland, they will get a constitutional majority, as, for example, Viktor Orban has already in Hungary. And then you're out of arguments, because then you cannot say, okay, they are breaking the laws. No, they're not, because they are acting according to the constitutions. They are changing the constitution, but they are changing it into a illiberal one. So you need to have another type of arguments. Not only legal arguments, but also ideological arguments, ethical arguments, which will tell people why it is wrong to change certain rules, even if this change is done legally. That was my point. So you have to differentiate between two types of arguments. If I have an opportunity to address what was being said before, I just want to say that obviously most of us would probably agree that people want freedom and they prosper under liberal regime better than under authoritarian one. I agree 100%. But I also say that it's not always that more freedom equals more innovation, or more freedom equals more satisfaction, more happiness, because people have different needs. Sometimes they need safety. And we can argue where this safety should come from, whether it should be states, local organizations, or some other entities. But what I just wanted to say and stress is that our values quite often they are in conflict with each other. So, for example, a recent example, the value that we all cherish, I guess, individual rights on the one hand, and on the other hand, property rights. And what you probably saw a couple of days ago was a hearing, Mark Zuckerberg's hearing before the Senate Commission, the Congressional Commission. And here you have a conflict of rights. Property rights, he built that company, he owns it, and he has the right to manage it whatever in a way he wants. But on the other hand, you see that the way the company has been managed creates a danger for some of our fundamental individual rights, for example, the right to make an informed political choice. And then how do you square this circle, right? It's just, you sometimes have to make compromises, and it's not always like that if you give Mark Zuckerberg more freedom, in this case, we will be better off as citizens, for example. That was my point.
I just wanted to make one quick clarification on the rule of law. We use that term all the time, and I think one of the things that people need to realize is that the rule of law has two components. One is the form of the law, and you were talking about when it might be legal for the government to do certain things, and we're just following the rules even though they're violating rights. So there has to be the form, the process, the process of creating through the legislature, through this deliberative process of actually creating law and then adjudicating law. It has to follow a certain form, but even more importantly, the second part is it has to have an object. It has to have a purpose. What is the purpose of the law? And to that, I say the purpose of the law is to respect individual rights. That's the purpose of the law. So.
It's always difficult to discuss the specifics of a country's policies if you are a foreigner. So I understand that the subtleties of American law are sometimes impenetrable. We have a very strict separation of powers. The executive handles the executive. It's unchallenged. The legislature handles the legislature. Unchallenged. The courts handle the courts. Unchallenged. They cannot interfere with each other, and if they have traditions, those all they are. Those are traditions. We used to have a tradition in America that Supreme Court judges were approved in a single day with no testimony. Well, that changed as the power of the Supreme Court grew. That was a new tradition. So the scrutiny that was given to President Obama's appointee was because the power of the court has grown so much that there's now more scrutiny, and the Senate has its own rules. Now, that was a tradition that was avoided. I grant you that. The Speaker is right. But let's look at the European Union. When Angela Merkel decided that the European Union's official policy, that those who are in migration, whether refugees or others, cross into the EU, they must be processed and handled in the first country they enter, which in many respects was Greece. That is a rule. She didn't consult anyone when she broke that rule and let 1 million Syrian, although how many were actually from Syria is debatable, 1 million Syrian refugees into Germany. That created a political uproar. The rise of Alternative for Deutschland, instability in government, lack of respect for the rule of law because Germans supposedly respect the rule of law, and they saw their chancellor completely ignoring an EU directive. You think that's the only example? What about the Maastricht Accords on deficits and spending, violated wholesale by France and Germany year after year after year? What about letting Greece into the European Union even though everybody knew they were lying about their economic statistics? So the breaking of rules happens on both sides. So let's not compare the tradition of a Senate not taking up a nominee with the blatant violations of the European Union's own rules. And on populism, and I'll finish with this, the reason we have to make distinctions is we have to make distinctions. Professor Balcerowicz was right. Populism is too amorphous and wide to be completely specific about it. It's almost always bad, but we can't always say it's bad. I'll give you examples. In Britain, the voters for Brexit, 65% of Tories, the party of Margaret Thatcher, voted for Brexit. Did they do that because they hated immigrants? In most cases, not. 65% of Tory voters voted for Brexit. In the United States, Donald Trump is not left-wing, he's incoherent. He doesn't believe in the right or left or up or down. He's a shark swimming around looking for attention. We have the largest deregulation in America under Donald Trump. We have the biggest tax cuts and tax reform in 30 years under Donald Trump. We have a court which actually has real constitutional scholars on it now. We have an amazing reformation of our military and our foreign policy, the defeat of ISIS. Now, I don't like Donald Trump. You can look up my articles opposing Donald Trump. But one of the dangers you must not fall into is don't separate the policies from the personalities. Viktor Orban is bad. Donald Trump is incoherent. That doesn't mean that it excuses you from actually looking at the policies and also comparing them to the other part of the problem, which is the EU also doesn't follow its own rules. And in Austria, The party that is now in coalition with the ruling People's Party, the party in power in Austria, is about to have massive deregulation, massive tax cuts, massive reforms of the government. And our host, Barbara Kohm, is one of the chief advisors to that coalition government, which won 59% of the vote. So not every populist party is the same. Not every populist party is Viktor Orban. And if we refuse to make distinctions, we cloud our thinking, and we will never communicate with anyone, whether that's somewheres or even anywheres.
Thank you, John. Chris Lingle, please.
Well, I just want to make one sort of clarification point. I think it becomes very useful if you understand the difference between this idea of the rule of law and legislation. The rule of law is meta law. It's law on a constitutional level, or you could call it even natural law, law that comes out of the nature of humanity. Legislation is any rubbish that men invent, or women in power, to control our lives. So it's really interesting to distinguish between these, because the question about should the government pass a law that's unconstitutional but would be used to expand freedom, first of all, it's somewhat incoherent. But what you're doing there is confusing the terms. The law, if you like, the rule of law, must be seen as something different. So journalists make this mistake, politicians make this mistake. This is a violation of the rule of law. That they're saying, you're violating our legislation, our regulation. But they violated the rule of law in putting that legislation or regulation into force. So this is what I try to use. I try almost never to say law when I speak about legislation, because that's created by man or men or women, whereas the rule of law is an evolutionary process of discovery in terms of of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Actually, I have one question, which is a bit different, because me, as a president of think tank, I'm looking for practical solutions. I'm thinking what to do to defend our freedom, to have the most interesting instruments actually to communicate with people. And I just read on the news that European Union as the institution is close to creating an instrument that will actually enable its citizens to promote democratic values. It's called EU Values Fund, which will be a huge amount of money spent from 2021 to 2027, but on actually promoting European values. I would like to ask you, what would you do with that money? I mean, you're getting the money for the program. Let's promote European values, and how do you spend it? 3 minutes for each.
Oh, I'll take 45 seconds. Here's what I'd like the European Union to promote as a European value. When your countries decide to hold referendums on European treaties or initiatives, you actually listen to the results. In France and the Netherlands in 2005, they voted against the Lisbon Treaty. They ignored that. When the Irish voted against it, they ignored that too. And then they bribed them and forced them to hold a second vote until it finally narrowly passed. When the European Union sees election results in Brexit, they try to ignore those too, and basically try to blackmail and intimidate the British into being punished for their independence. I would like the European Union to promote European values that when a national electorate actually votes, it means something. If you disagree with it, you argue against it. You don't ignore the people as if they're a bunch of clay that doesn't have a thought in its brain.
Well, we've recently had a very similar program launched in Poland called Polish National Foundation, with the aim of promoting the Polish image abroad. So another huge program with public money. What could go wrong? So my answer is that we wouldn't take the money, no matter the amount, because I simply don't believe that you can truly commit to promoting these values that we believe when you are basically forced to dance on a leash that public money or public grant system forces you to adopt. This is an approach that we've committed to a few years ago. I know that most of the Polish think tanks, FOR as well, is strongly committed to this approach as well. And I believe that that's the way. If we want to truly establish these ideas, we need to lead by example. And we can do it if we are to compromise or adopt even a part of agenda which the EU would obviously force upon us if we are to take this money.
It's pretty hard to top that answer. I mean, that money comes with a leash like that. But if I have to come up with something different, I would give it to 3 women. I would give it to Bobby Herzberg, I'd give it to Shari Williams, and I'd give it to Barbara Cole to expand, expand these ideas of freedom.
I'll take it. No. And give it back to you.
If I was to spend this money, basically I think I would go along the lines sketched recently by someone you probably wouldn't call a liberal here, but maybe Emmanuel Macron and his recent speech at the European Parliament. Obviously, Macron argues for more European integration on many levels, but his major point was the point I was also trying to make here. Make distinction between democracy, liberalism, and somehow picture or show the dangers that are behind those seemingly benign concepts of illiberal democracy. I would try to show people what actually lies behind that, this kind of projects.
Well, it's always hard when you discuss taking government money. And it's especially hard, I think, right now, where political correctness and some of the limitations on hate speech, etc., suggest that perhaps what those values are is a way of manipulating people into a much narrower band rather than dealing with the realities of difference and diversity of opinion that's out there. And so I would be very wary of any government program. Now, would I take the money? Absolutely. I might just dig a hole and put the money in, to the extent that if we did that, at least it would keep the money out of the hands of others who would be happy to line up for this and tell us what the real values of people in our society are. And they're out there everywhere. Look at the universities. Other than private universities and others like this, there are plenty of universities where academics are willing to tell you what your values should be and who are deplorables. And who doesn't deserve to have a voice because they don't have the right opinions. And so part of me would want to just take it to keep it out of others' hands, but I think it's always worrisome.
Thank you so much. So, okay, we are not taking the money, but still working hard on promoting freedom in Poland, in America, and in your countries. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Austrian Economic Center. As you know, we wanted to promote somebody who was the most active, and I would like to give this book to this young man in red shirt who now is covering actually red shirt with this. Yeah. You can have the autograph and to come later after the. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you next year. And thank you, panelists.